how do you organize a show when you're programming it?
So when you're programming a show, mixers typically have either 8 or 12 faders to work on, depending on what console they're on. And for the show, you end up, you either have one fader per person. So if there's, like for Miss Saigon, it's a show that typically you only really have Chris, the engineer, Kim, and then a couple other more minor characters, but you have those three who are the major people, and then it's usually them talking and interacting, and then some scenes with big chorus numbers and things like that. So most of that show, it makes sense if you have a specific person on a specific fader. Like the engineer is always 1, Kim is always 2, Chris is always 3. So you can, whenever you have that person, like whenever you have Kim, you always know you're going back to fader 2. So it makes more sense in your head to be like, okay, great, I'm always grabbing for this fader. And then there's another way of doing it, which is called kind of a typewriter method, where if you're thinking of like a typewriter just kind of goes all the way down the line, dings, and you go back to the beginning and do that again. And that's really good for lines that have a lot of, or for scenes that have a lot of quick movement between lines and actors, where you throw fader 1 up, then 2 up, then 3 up, then 4 up, then whenever you need to go back, you go back to the beginning, start at 1 and continue on. And that's something like for Mean Girls, where you do have a core group of people. You have Katie, Janice, Damien, and then the Plastics. But if you count just those 6, there's still 6 of them. So depending on the scene, it might be easier just to have them in line of have them in order of which lines they're doing. And so it depends a lot on the show for how you organize it. And you usually end up using a combination of those. Like if Katie tracks from one scene to another, even if overall you're doing where it kind of goes in order of who's talking, you might keep her, like if she's on fader 1, you'll keep her on fader 1 for the next scene and stuff like that. So she doesn't randomly switch and you're trying to search for wherever she is. So the biggest thing for when you're programming a show is to make sure that it's logical, because you don't want to, if you're sitting there with 8 faders, you don't want to be bouncing between 1, 7, 2, 4, 1, 6, and your brain has a harder time keeping up with that, and your brain already has enough to do while you're mixing. So you want to make sure that that part of it is as easy and as logical to follow as possible.
And how do you mix line by line if several people sing simultaneously, like Confrontation or One Day More in Les Mis, for example?
So those scenes, you have to take those on a case-by-case basis. Like with the Confrontation, you have Valjean and Javert are singing at the same time, and you kind of have to pick out what information you want to hear. And for a lot of it, sometimes it's if a character is giving you new information, you want to focus on that person, or if they're reiterating an important theme or something like that, you might focus on them. But that was a situation where they're both giving you kind of the same information, where Javert keeps saying that, yeah, I'm gonna find you no matter what, I'm still gonna get you, and Valjean saying, like, let me go, I'm trying to help this woman, I'll keep doing what I have to do to help people. And so at that point, I went to the associate designer and was like, what do you want me to do with this? What is the best method for this? What are you looking for? And he told me, he's like, oh, well, you're trying to keep the person who's on top musically, who's doing the higher notes, you want them to be the ones sticking out of the mix. So I ended up going back to the music for it and went and said, okay, so he's got the top line here, Valjean's got it here, Javert's got it here, and then you kind of figure out, okay, we're going back and forth this way. And then for me, once I know musically what's happening, I can go back and say like, okay, so these are the words that we're focusing on. And then also you have One Day More, where you have the entire cast are all singing different things all at the same time. And that's the same thing, where you just have to figure out what you're picking out. And that's another case of everyone singing their own theme. And there's a little bit of new information coming to you, but a lot of it is just repeating themes that you have to pick out what's happening. And that was another one where I'm talking to the designer to say, okay, what do you want? What do we need to follow? And that's to a point. For something new, the designer might let you kind of figure out what you wanted to do, but especially since Les Mis has been going on for 30 30 years, I think, 35, something like that. It's at the point where they know what they want. They've established what's going to happen. So in that case, it was easier to just ask what was going on. But yeah, it's something that if it's a new piece of new information, I'll always go with that first. But if it's just a cacophony of noise almost, you have to pick what you want to hear and make sure that those bits get out while you still make sure that everyone is still being heard. So it's a little bit of a, I don't know what's the best word to say, but it's a little bit of kind of an art to mix everything together so that you're still getting the bits that you want, but hearing everything that's going on at the same time.
It's so interesting. You have such a fascinating occupation.
It's a lot of fun though.
What do you love the most about mixing musicals?
I really love when you have these little moments where you kind of get to connect with everything because you're out in the house and so you're getting to hear a lot of what's going on with the audience, but you're also helping to drive the music and the voices and combine everything into one. So you get some really good moments where you kind of get to experience it as the audience does, where you get to see where everything kind of comes together. And there's one of my favorite moments is also in Les Mis, where our Valjean sings Bring Him Home. And the man we had playing Valjean, his name is Nick Cartel, he was fantastic. He completely embodied the role. He is an incredibly sweet and generous man all on his own, even outside the theater. And his voice was perfectly in that range for Valjean. He really had such a grasp of the character that it was great to mix him. Plus you have this amazing music and we had an amazing orchestra. Our conductor, you could tell when he was really ready to get into a song because he would get rid of the baton and just conduct with his hands. And he did that almost every single night for Bring Him Home. So I was not the only person who enjoyed that. But you had this point at the end of the song where he holds out that last note, and throughout the entire song, like I'm pushing the band, pushing the vocals, making sure everything works together, that you get the right dynamics. But when we got to the end, I actually had a moment where he would start the final note, the band would start that final sustain, and I didn't need to do anything anymore. So I would hands off the board and I could step back a step, which usually doesn't happen during the show unless there's absolutely nothing going on, like there's canned music playing or something like that. And even now when I just listen to cast recordings or something of the show, I can physically feel my body relax at that last note because it's just been so ingrained that you can just let them take it and let it go, and I didn't have to do a thing. And you would hear, as Nick's sustaining this note, you would hear people in the audience just do these little sighs, and it's hard to describe because it was just such an amazing moment. And it's one of those times where you really feel like there's a connection between the show and the audience and the actors, and that's such an amazing moment to have, and I love having those moments. So that's definitely the best part about mixing shows, is just getting those little bits of time where you can feel the connection that's happening between the audience and what's going on stage.
Oh, that sounds incredible. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, thank you.
Anything else you want to talk about before we call it off? I kept it for so long last time and I feel so bad.
No, I mean, as you can see, I can literally talk about this for hours. I have no problem with that. I was actually joking with Mark, and I was sitting there and it's just like, that's what stagehands do. We sit in the bar and we just chat and trade stories. So it's, so many of us have literally trained for this for decades of, yeah, I can tell stories for hours. It doesn't matter. But yeah, no,
it's such an amazing show. It's one of my favorite.
Yes, mine too. It's one of those timeless ones that no matter how many times you see it, it's always got such a good message. And I saw, with all the riots and everything going on, I saw someone post, it was a meme about, you know how in Les Mis, like, you're rooting for the guys who are building the barricades in the streets, you're on the side of the guy who is an ex-convict, and you're rooting against the guy who's supposed to be the voice of law and order because you can see that he's manically pursuing this guy. And it's kind of like, we need more of that in our life. And it's literally, it was written 200 years ago, 300 years. I don't feel like it was 17 1800s. I probably should know that, but I don't. But yeah, it's just such a good story, and it resonates even now with when you have any kind of struggle with people struggling to be heard. You have that song, Do You Hear the People Sing? That's literally saying, shut up and listen, I'm trying to tell you something important. So yeah, it's such a good show, and it resonates throughout time.